I work in a museum of death. That's what the Heritage Wing feels like. While the rest of Street Aethelgard's hospital is a gleaming monolith of steel, glass, and fluorescent lights, the basement is a relic. It smells of limestone dust, formaldehyde, and something older like the dry, sweet scent of pressed flowers in a forgotten Bible. My name is Julian. I'm a mortuary technician, ostensibly. But down here, surrounded by vaulted brick ceilings and iron pillars that look like they belong in a Dickens novel, I feel more like a crypt keeper. The Heritage Wing Morgue was built in 1890, funded by the eccentric industrialist Cornelius Van Eck. He endowed the hospital with a fortune, ensuring it would remain cutting edge for centuries. But his money came with a catch. A clause in his will so specific and bizarre that lawyers have tried to break it for 100 years without success. The Lazarus Clause. Van Eck suffered from severe taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. It was a common terror in the Victorian era, fueled by sensational stories of claw marks found on the inside of coffin lids. To soothe his anxiety, Van Eck mandated that every corpse processed in this specific wing must be fitted with a Lazarus bell. It works like this. Before we slide a body into the cold storage drawer, we tie a piece of red silk thread to the big toe. The thread runs through a small grommet in the heavy oak door of the cooler and connects to a brass bell hanging on a hook outside. If the corpse wakes up and wiggles the toe, the bell rings. The technician hears it. A life is saved. In 2024, with EKG machines, brain scans, and rigor mortis, the chances of mistakenly declaring someone dead are statistically zero. We know they're dead, we check, double check, but we still tie the bells. Tradition, or superstition, or just the price of keeping the endowment checks clearing. Most of the techs hate it. They call it playing Santa's sleigh. They rush through it, tying loose knots just to tick the box. I don't mind it. I have a history degree. I appreciate the ritual. There's something respectful about it, one last safeguard, however archaic. It was a Tuesday night in November. A nor'easter was battering Boston, the wind howling down the elevator shafts like a lost soul. The lights in the morgue flickered every time the thunder rolled, casting long, jumping shadows against the arched walls. I was alone. The day shift had clocked out early to beat the storm. I had 3 guests for the night. In drawer 1 lay Mrs. Gable, 82 years old, heart failure. She looked peaceful, her white hair brushed back, her hands folded. In drawer 2 lay Mr. Renwick, 45, car accident, hydroplaned on I-93. His chest was crushed, but his face was untouched. He looked surprised. In drawer 3 lay a John Doe, found floating in Boston Harbor near the fish pier. He was bloated, his skin the color of a bruised plum. No ID, just a tattoo of an anchor on his forearm. I went through the motions. I filled out the paperwork. I checked the toe tags, then the bells. I took the spool of red silk thread from the antique dispenser on the wall. I cut 3 lengths. I walked to drawer 1. I tied the thread around Mrs. Gable's cold, stiff toe. I threaded it through the door. I hung the small brass bell on the hook. It was shaped like a flower bud, etched with Van Eck's initials. I did the same for Mr. Renwick. Then the John Doe. His skin was slippery, waterlogged. The thread dug into the swollen flesh. I closed the heavy oak drawers. Thud, thud, thud. I sat down at my desk, situated in the center of the room under the warm glow of a Tiffany lamp. I opened my book of biography of Rasputin and poured a cup of coffee from my thermos. The silence settled in. It wasn't a quiet silence. The storm outside provided a backdrop of rain lashing against the high barred windows at ground level. But inside, the stillness was absolute. No humming refrigerators. The cooling system here was a gravity-fed ammonia loop from the 1920s, utterly silent. No beeping monitors. Just me and the dead. I read for an hour. The storm intensified. A crack of thunder shook the floor, rattling the instruments on the stainless steel prep tables. I looked up, waiting for the lights to go out. They dimmed, buzzed, then brightened. I went back to my book. Ting. I froze. My eyes didn't move from the page, but my entire body went rigid. It was a small sound. Tiny. Tinny. The sound of brass hitting brass. I waited. Maybe it was the radiator expanding. Maybe it was a drop of water hitting a metal tray. Ting. Louder this time. Deliberate. I slowly lowered the book. I looked at the wall of drawers. The brass bells hung in a neat row. Bell number 1 was still. Bell number 2 was still. Bell number 3. It was swaying. Just slightly. Like a pendulum caught in a draft. But there was no draft. The room was sealed. I stared at it. The little flower bud bell swung left, hit the wood of the drawer, swung right. Ting. It wasn't the wind. Something was pulling the thread. From the inside. I stood up slowly, careful not to scrape my chair against the tile floor. My heart did a painful stutter step in my chest. "It's just gas," I whispered. My voice sounded too loud in the vaulted room. Gas buildup. A muscle spasm. Galvanic response. It's a real thing. Even after death, the body has residual electricity. Muscles contract as chemicals break down. I've seen corpses sit up on the table before collapsing back down. I've seen fingers twitch. I've heard the death-groan air escaping through vocal cords as the body shifts. It's biology. It's chemistry. It's not ghosts. I walked toward drawer 3. My footsteps echoed wetly, though the floor was dry. The bell was still swaying. The arc was small, maybe an inch. I reached out and steadied it with my finger. The brass was cold. The vibration stopped. I looked at the red silk thread. It ran through the grommet into the dark interior of the drawer. It was taut. Usually, there's a bit of slack, but this thread was pulled tight, vibrating like a violin string. "Okay, John Doe," I muttered. "Let's see what you're doing." I gripped the heavy iron handle of the drawer. The latch was stiff. I had to put my shoulder into it. Click-clack. I pulled the drawer open. The smell of harbor water and decay wafted out. The John Doe lay on the stainless steel tray, the sheet draped over his bloated form. I pulled the sheet back from his feet. His right foot, the one with the thread, was flexed. The toes were curled downward, gripping invisible sand. As I watched, the leg jerked. It wasn't a twitch, it was a kick. A violent, spasmodic thrash. His knee bent, then straightened, slamming his heel against the metal tray. Telling. The thread snapped. The bell on the outside of the drawer flew off its hook, bouncing across the tile floor with a series of bright, cheerful chimes. Ting, 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 ting. I jumped back, colliding with the autopsy table. Instruments clattered to the floor. Jesus! I stared at the body. The leg stopped moving. It settled back onto the tray, limp. I grabbed my stethoscope from my pocket. I don't know why. Instinct. I pressed the diaphragm against the John Doe's swollen chest. Silence, no heartbeat, no rush of air. Just the squelch of decomposing tissue shifting under pressure. He was dead, stone dead. Muscle spasm, I said again. Louder this time, trying to convince the room. Big one. I checked the monitor mounted on the wall above the drawers. Flatline. I took a deep breath. I picked up the bell from the floor. I found the spool of thread. I had to retie it. It was the rule. My hands were shaking as I looped the silk around the cold, wet big toe. I felt the skin give under the pressure. It felt like dough. I threaded the silk through the door. I closed the drawer. Thud. I hung the bell back on the hook. It hung still. Silent. I turned to go back to my desk. From inside drawer 3, I heard a sound. It was faint, muffled by the thick oak. A wet, gurgling exhale. Ha! It sounded like a man surfacing after holding his breath underwater for too long. I spun around. Drawer 3 shivered, and then the bell on drawer 1 rang. Ting. Mrs. Gable. I looked at drawer 1. The bell wasn't just swaying, it was jumping, like someone was plucking the string. Ting, 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 ting. Then drawer 2, Mr. Renwick. Clang. His bell hit the wood hard. I backed away, retreating to the center of the room. The 3 bells hung in a row. They weren't swaying in unison. They were independent. Drawer 1, ting, ting, ting. Slow, rhythmic. Drawer 2, clang, clang, clang. Fast, frantic. Drawer 3, ting, violent, single strikes. It sounded like a wind chime factory in a hurricane. The sound filled the morgue, bouncing off the brick arches, amplifying. I grabbed the phone on my desk. I needed security. I needed a doctor. I needed anyone who wasn't. I put the receiver to my ear. No dial tone. Just static. But it wasn't white noise. It sounded like rushing water, like the ocean. And underneath the roar of the waves, I heard something else. Whispering. Hundreds of voices, overlapping, urgent. Not yet, not yet. Hide us. Hide us. I slammed the phone down. The bells were getting louder. The heavy oak drawers began to rattle in their frames. Thump, 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 thump. They weren't just wiggling their toes anymore. They were kicking the doors. I retreated to my office, a glass-walled cubicle in the corner of the main room. It offered no real protection, but it felt like a barrier. I locked the door, which was laughable. If the dead were walking, a wafer tumbler lock wasn't going to stop them. I turned up the radio I kept on my desk. Classical music, Mozart, anything to drown out the sound of the bells. But the bells cut through the violins. They were discordant, sharp, piercing. I looked through the glass. The wall of drawers was vibrating. Dust was falling from the mortar between the bricks above them. The bells weren't just ringing randomly anymore. They had synchronized. Drawer 1, ting. Drawer 2, ting. Drawer 3, clang. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It was a waltz. A macabre, metallic waltz. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. No signal. Of course. We were 3 stories underground in a bunker made of limestone and iron. I grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from my desk, another Van Eyck relic. It felt solid in my hand. A weapon. I stepped out of the office. The air in the morgue had changed. The smell of formaldehyde was gone, replaced by the scent of ozone and wet earth. The temperature had plummeted. I could see my breath puffing in white clouds. I walked toward the drawers. "Stop it," I yelled. "You're dead." Stop moving. The banging increased. Tump, tump, tump. It sounded like they were trying to break out. But then I noticed something. The force wasn't directed outward. They weren't pushing against the doors to open them. They were scrabbling. Scratching. I put my ear to drawer 2, Mr. Renwick. Inside, I heard fingernails tearing at the wood. Frantic, desperate, and a voice, muffled, rasping, dry. "Let me out, let me out. It's coming. Not I'm coming out. Let me out." He was asking for permission. Or help. I looked at drawer 3. The John Doe. He wasn't scratching. He was slamming his body against the side of the cooler. Wham! "Hide me," a wet voice gurgled from inside. "Hide me deep." I backed away. Hide me from what? The lights flickered. The filament in the Tiffany lamp buzzed and popped. The room plunged into darkness, save for the emergency light's dim red bulbs mounted near the ceiling. In the crimson gloom, the morgue looked like the inside of a heart. And in the corner of the room, near the ventilation shaft, the shadows began to move. They didn't just lengthen, they detached. Pools of darkness peeled themselves off the wall and stood up. They were tall, thin, formless. They looked like tears in the fabric of reality. The bells went wild. Clang, 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 clang. The corpses weren't trying to scare me. They were sounding the alarm. They were ringing the Lazarus bells to warn the living. It's here. The shadow things drifted across the floor. They didn't walk. They flowed. They moved toward the drawers. I realized then what the Lazarus Clause was really about. Van Eyck hadn't been afraid of waking up in a coffin. He hadn't been afraid of suffocation. He had been afraid of collection. He knew that sometimes death doesn't stick. Sometimes the soul lingers. And when it lingers, something comes to get it. And he had put bells on the toes so the technicians would know when the collectors arrived. I gripped the candlestick. The first shadow reached drawer 1. Mrs. Gable. It extended a hand or a tendril of smoke and touched the wood. The oak hissed. Steam rose from the varnish. The bell in Mrs. Gable's drawer stopped ringing instantly. Silence from drawer 1. Then the drawer latch clicked. Slowly, smoothly, the drawer slid open. Mrs. Gable sat up. In the red light, she looked terrifying. Her jaw was slack, the rigor mortis broken. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. But she didn't look at the shadow. She looked at me. She raised a hand. She pointed at the shadow, and she screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was the sound of a violin string snapping. The shadow lunged. It wrapped around her. It didn't attack her body. It attacked her light. I saw a faint, white glow rise from Mrs. Gable's chest. Her soul? Her energy? The shadow swallowed it. Mrs. Gable collapsed back onto the slab. She was just meat again. The animation, the fear, the life gone. The shadow grew larger. It seemed denser. Sated it. It turned toward drawer 2, Mr. Renwick. His bell was ringing so hard it was vibrating off the hook. Ting, ting, ding, ding. He knew he was next. I couldn't just watch. I didn't know these people, but they were my charges. They were under my protection. I stepped forward. I raised the candlestick. Hey! I shouted at the darkness. Get away from him. The shadow stopped. It turned. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze. It felt like standing naked in a blizzard. It looked at me. It considered me. And then it smiled. Not with a mouth. But the darkness shifted, tearing open a horizontal slit of absolute void. It moved toward me. I swung the candlestick. It passed right through the shadow form like it was cutting through fog. The momentum carried me forward, and I stumbled, nearly crashing into the open drawer of Mrs. Gable. The cold that radiated from the entity was paralyzing. It wasn't just temperature. It was entropy. It was the feeling of the universe winding down. My arm went numb. The brass candlestick fell from my fingers and clattered to the floor. The shadow ignored me. I wasn't ripe yet. I was still tethered to my mortal coil. It wanted the loose ones. It turned back to drawer 2. Clang, clang, clang. Mr. Renwick was fighting for his afterlife. The latch on drawer 2 shattered. The heavy iron mechanism snapped like brittle candy. The drawer flew open, sliding out on its rails with the screech of metal on metal. Mr. Renwick sat up. His chest was a caved-in ruin of crushed ribs and purple bruising from the steering wheel impact. But he moved with frantic, terrified energy. He scrambled off the slab, his legs tangling in the sheet. He hit the floor hard. Thump. He didn't try to stand. His legs were broken. He crawled. He dragged himself across the tiles using his elbows, leaving a smear of post-mortem fluids behind him. He was crawling toward me. Hide me, he rasped. His voice was a wet wheeze, air bubbling through blood in his lungs. Please, it's cold. It's so cold. I looked at him. He wasn't a monster. He was a victim. A man who had died violently and wasn't ready to go. Get under the table, I yelled, pointing to the stainless steel autopsy station. Renwick scrambled under the table, curling into a fetal ball. He pressed his face against the cold metal leg of the table, whimpering. The shadow drifted closer. Drawer 3 burst open. The John Doe. He didn't crawl. He fell. He flopped onto the floor like a landed fish, water pouring from his mouth. He pushed himself backward until his back hit the wall. He stared at the shadow with milky, dead eyes. No ticket, he gurgled. I didn't buy a ticket. The shadow loomed over him. It reached out. The John Doe screamed. A bubble of seawater burst from his lips. I looked around the room. I needed something. Salt, iron, the bells. The sound of the bells had seemed to irritate it, the sharp, high-frequency resonance of the brass. When Mrs. Gable's bell stopped ringing, the shadow had been able to take her. But Renwick and the doe were still moving. Their bells were still attached to their toes, dragging on the floor, clinking faintly. Ting. Ting. I grabbed the spare bells from my desk drawer. Van Eck had left a box of them. I grabbed a handful. I shook them. Jingle-a-jangle. It wasn't Christmas. It was chaos. The shadow recoiled. It shrank back, its edges vibrating. The void-slit mouth closed. The sound waves. They disrupted its cohesion. Renwick, I yelled. Kick! Move your feet! Renwick understood. From under the table, he started thrashing his broken legs. Ting, ting, ting. The John Doe kicked his heels against the wall. Clang, clang, clang. I shook the handful of bells in my fist. I screamed, Get back! You can't have 'em! The shadow hissed. It sounded like a tire deflating. It swiped at me. A tendril of darkness lashed out. It hit my shoulder. Pain exploded in my arm. Not physical pain. It felt like someone had injected ice water into my veins. I dropped the bells. They scattered across the floor. The noise stopped. The shadow grew again. It towered over me, filling the room, blocking out the red emergency lights. It was going to take us all. Then from the corner of the room, a new sound. Bong. Deep. Resonant. Heavy. It wasn't a Lazarus bell. I looked over. Drawer 4. Empty. Unused for years. But the bell hook on the outside. Hanging there was a bell I had never seen before. It was larger. Iron. Rusted black. And it was swinging. Bong. The door of drawer 4 opened slowly. A hand reached out. It wasn't fresh. It was skeletal. Desiccated. The skin was like parchment. An arm followed, clad in the tattered remains of a velvet tuxedo. Then a face. A skull, really, with tufts of white hair clinging to the scalp. It was Cornelius Van Eck. He had been interred in his own morgue. In the wall, watching, the skeleton climbed out of the drawer. It stood up, dust falling from its joints. It looked at the shadow. It pointed a bony finger at the entity, and it opened its jaw. It didn't speak. It screamed. But the scream wasn't vocal. It was the sound of 1,000 bells ringing at once. A sonic blast of pure brass fury. The shadow shrieked. It tried to cover its non-existent ears. It began to tear apart. The smoke unraveled. Van Eck walked toward it. He grabbed the shadow by its throat, or what passed for a throat. He squeezed. The shadow exploded. It burst into a cloud of black ash that swirled around the room and was sucked into the ventilation grate with a howl of defeat. The cold lifted instantly. Van Eck turned to me. His eye sockets were empty, but I felt him wink. He pointed to the floor. To the bells I had dropped. Keep ringing, the jester said. Then he climbed back into drawer 4. He pulled the heavy oak door shut. Thud. Silence returned. Mr. Renwick crawled out from under the table. He looked at me. He looked at his own dead hands. He sighed. A long, final exhale. He slumped over. The terror left his face. He was just a body again. The John Doe slid down the wall. His eyes closed. They were gone. Really gone this time. I stood there, shivering, surrounded by scattered bells and the wreckage of the night. The storm outside had passed. The thunder was gone. I checked my watch. 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes to shift change. I spent the next hour working harder than I ever had in my life. Dead weight is called dead weight for a reason. Lifting Mr. Renwick back onto the slab was a feat of leverage and grunt work. His limbs were stiffening again. Rigor mortis reclaiming what the panic had loosened. I folded his hands over his chest. I closed his eyes. I dragged Mrs. Gable back into her drawer. She was lighter, but her skin was fragile. I had to be careful not to tear it. The John Doe was the worst. He was slippery. I had to use a towel to get a grip on his ankles. I slid him back into drawer 3. I cleaned the floor. I mopped up the seawater, the fluids, the dust from Van Eyck's tomb. I picked up every single brass bell and put them back in the box on my desk. I fixed the latches. A little percussive maintenance with a rubber mallet bent the iron back into shape. When the elevator doors dinged at 7:00 a.m., the morgue looked pristine. Dr. Vance walked in. He was the great-grandson of the founder, a tall, severe man who always looked like he was smelling something unpleasant. He carried a travel mug of coffee and a tablet. "Good morning, Julian," he said, not looking up. "Quiet night?" I stood by my desk. My uniform was rumpled. There was a smear of grave dust on my cheek that I had missed. "The bells rang," I said. Vance stopped. He lowered the tablet. He looked at me with eyes that were the exact same shade of pale blue as the portrait of Cornelius Van Eyck hanging in the lobby. "Did they?" he asked softly. "Drawer 1, 2, and 3. And drawer 4. Vance went still. He looked at the wall of drawers. He looked at drawer 4. "Drawer 4 hasn't been opened in 80 years, he said. "It opened last night." Vance walked over to drawer 4. He touched the wood gently, almost reverently. He traced the grain. "Did you see him?" Vance whispered. "I saw him." "And the collector?" "Gone." "For now." Vance nodded. He turned back to me. A rare thin smile touched his lips. "Good work, Julian. That is why we pay you the shift differential. Most technicians quit after the first ting." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "About what this place is?" Vance took a sip of coffee. "Would you have taken the job?" "Probably not." "Exactly. But you have the temperament for it. You respect the dead. You don't mock the bells." He walked to his office. Before he closed the door, he looked back. "Take the rest of the week off, with pay. And Julian?" "Yes, check your shoes before you leave." I looked down. Tied to the lace of my left work boot, hidden under the cuff of my pants, was a small, red silk thread, and hanging from it, a tiny brass bell. I hadn't put it there. I untied it. I held it in my hand. I walked out of the hospital into the bright, blinding morning sun. The city was waking up. Cars honked. People shouted. Life. I walked to the subway station. As I descended the stairs into the tunnel, I heard it. Ting. I stopped. I looked behind me. A commuter in a gray suit was walking down the stairs. He brushed past me, reading a newspaper. Ting. The sound came from his briefcase. I looked at his feet. There was no bell. But his shadow didn't match his movement. It was lagging behind. And it looked hungry. I turned and ran back up the stairs. I called a cab. I wasn't going underground, not today. I still work at Street Aethelgard's. I still tie the bells, but I've made some changes to my routine. I bring a bag of rock salt with me every night. I line the threshold of the morgue, and I wear a bell. A small silver one on a chain around my neck, because the collector is still out there. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right down the elevator shaft, I hear the ting-ting-ting of something testing the locks. Death is a door. But sometimes you have to hold the handle so it doesn't swing both ways.